Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, DEI 2.0, What's Next with Content and Collaboration, which is sponsored by ProQuest, part of Clarivate. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We do expect many questions and we likely will not have time to get to all of them, so we apologize in advance for that. But we will answer as many questions as we have time for, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Christy.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Christy Freyer, Product Marketing Manager at ProQuest, part of Clarivate. I'm excited to welcome you all to our program and introduce our speakers. Leading our webinar today is Mark Puente, an Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Inclusion, and Diversity at Purdue University. With over a decade of experience as the former Director of Diversity and Leadership Programs at the Association of Research Libraries, Mark brings valuable insights on developing inclusive research library collections. After Mark's presentation, Nathalie Duval, our Director of Product Management for Historical Collections, will give us her insights on DEI content and collaboration from a product manager's perspective. Finally, we'll conclude with a dedicated Q&A session. So without further ado, let's kick things off with Mark Puente. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks everyone for help who had a hand in helping to organize us today. This is a bit of a repetition here with our title slide, but I did want to take just a moment. As I indicated, I am situated today at Purdue University. It is in West Lafayette, Indiana, and I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional homelands and the indigenous people that are part of the culture of this area and who once resided on this land on which Purdue is currently built. So I would like to honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, the Lenape, the Miami, and the Shawnee people who are the ancestral inhabitants and caretakers of this land, and who through colonization and force, at best, maybe genocide at worst, were again removed from this land, and many of their inhabitants still occupy these lands, or lands to which they were removed and displaced. So I realize that to some this may seem a bit of a performative gesture, but to simply acknowledge the realities and the impact of settler colonialism on indigenous communities. But I do believe that we start with learning about history that is often untold, which is, of course, I think a great lesson for the topic at hand this morning or today. So just wanted to take that moment. So I wanted to reframe this a little bit. I'm not complaining about the title, but I'm sort of reframing this discussion and providing this sort of alternate title. If you build it, will they come? The trials and tribulations with developing more inclusive research library collections. I think probably there are many people on this call, maybe all on this call, who are going through the same issues as we are, that have the same questions that we have. Maybe your processes, maybe your policies, maybe your strategies are a little bit different, but I think many of us are really working hard and struggling to make sense out of what it means to build an inclusive collection, a more diverse collection. So I wanted to provide just a little bit of context about Purdue University and Purdue University Libraries and School of Information Studies. We have to have that that in the moniker as well. But some of you may know or may not know that we are, in fact, a land grant institution. We are a public institution that was established to serve all of the citizens of the state of Indiana and, of course, beyond. We are located in central Indiana, just north of Indianapolis, a bit southeast of the greater Chicagoland area. Some would say right in the middle of the cornfield, but there's a lot more than just corn to this particular geographical area. Purdue University is, of course, known to many for our STEM programs, our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics programs, especially things like aeronautics and astronautics. You may have heard of some of our important alumni, such as Neil Armstrong. We currently have a wonderful exhibition in our special collections on the life and legacy of Amelia Earhart. So we're very famous for that, but also have notable programs in computer science, health sciences, veterinary medicine, and a lot of firsts. There are many landmarks and many firsts, like, for example, the first PhD and Black PhDs in many disciplines come out of Purdue University. But we're not only focused on STEM programs, of course. We do have notable programs in other disciplines and other domains, such as business, such as in education, humanities, social sciences, etc. So we are a very large research institution. We are breaking records annually with respect to enrollment of our student population, and this year we exceeded 50,000, which is hard to fathom. I mean, that's a large student population. But interestingly enough, one metric, we are only at 2.65% enrollment of Black or African American students. Again, we are a land grant institution. We are supposed to serve the entire state of Indiana and its citizenry, but we are really struggling with respect to meeting the enrollment percentages of our Black student population. The overall Indiana population is something in the neighborhood of 8.5 Black or African American. We're doing a little bit better with respect to Latinos, Latinx students at 6.29. I think maybe something that you might find interesting as well is we, I think, are a bit anomalous in the campus level in that our provost or vice provost, excuse me, for diversity, inclusion, and belonging is not the chief diversity officer of the institution. That is, in fact, the provost. So, you can imagine what that communicates and some of the advantages and complications that comes with that. But so that's just a little bit of some context about Purdue University. We'll go on here. Specifically about our libraries and about the School of Information Studies. I'm not going to read all of this text to you. The next couple of slides are very text heavy, but suffice it to say that the diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion, it's called different things at different times. We have gone through a process of sort of rebranding that as diversity, inclusion, and belonging at a campus level, although we locally within the Libraries and School of Information Studies use a different acronym, but we'll talk about that. But diversity, inclusion, and belonging, those priorities you will find deeply embedded across much of our strategic plan. So we don't at this point have a separate strategic plan or an action plan that is focused on diversity. But again, you will see this reflected in many of the strategic objectives and strategic priorities of the organization if you look at that strategic plan that you'll find on the website. And I'm just to highlight here with respect to our mission, providing equitable access to diverse resources. This is very much part, we see this very much part of our charge and part of our strategies that we are building and implementing moving forward. Again, from our mission and the strategic plan, references, collections, and resources, and our responsibilities to stewarding collections and resources and building a portfolio that really prioritizes diversity, inclusion, and belonging through all of our collections, our general collections, right, our distinctive collections, our archival collections, and that sort of thing. So this is something that we are intentional about, and we are in early stages, I think, of developing specific tactics that will contribute to the development of more diverse and inclusive collections. But I think we are working hard to make a difference. We certainly are. Again, this is a very text-heavy sort of slide. I won't read all of this, but goal 4 is specifically focused on diversity, inclusion, and belonging as it relates to the libraries and to the School of Information Studies. So again, one of the areas that we have decided to focus on in the next 3 years is assessment, and we will talk about that just in a moment with respect to the challenges of assessing diversity within large research collections. But we do that and we'll focus on that in such a way that that will assess not only our materials, right, or also our environment, but also assess where we are as individuals and as an organization in terms of our level of commitment to engagement with and involvement with issues around diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So I encourage you to look at our strategic plan, and you can find, of course, a lot more information about our efforts on the website. So some specific just information or framing about our libraries and School of Information Studies. So we are fairly anomalous in that we are in fact a School of Information Studies, but we do not in fact confer an information studies degree. So that's a little bit odd, you know, and I understand that, but that's sort of the reality of where we are as an organization and an institution. We do have a heavy faculty culture here. So many of our librarians, not all of our librarians, do have faculty status, and many of them teach 4-credit courses. Some of them are embedded, of course, within our School of Information Studies. Some of them are collaborations with other subject area specialists, other departments, and that sort of thing. So, but we do have some distinctive offerings. So we do have a digital humanities certificate as well as a GIS certificate that both of those are growing, and we are in the process of exploring other certificates that we as an academic unit within the university may want to offer. And again, through conversations around content, conversations around pedagogy, diversity, inclusion, and belonging are embedded through all of those conversations and through all of those strategic priorities. We do not have what I might consider a traditional liaison model. We certainly probably have not used the term bibliographer in many, many, many years. We probably have not used the term bibliographic instruction in many, many years. But it doesn't mean that liaison activity doesn't happen and that collections building doesn't happen by our faculty librarians, but we just don't have that traditional liaison model as many people might think about that and conceptualize that. We do have a digital first collection strategy. So where possible, whenever possible, we do acquire content that is digital first. And so that's probably not unlike a lot of your efforts and that sort of thing. But we do also have, of course, a patron-driven acquisition sort of policy and practice that we hope gets the resources to instructors, teachers, students as they need, you know, in their time of need. Again, as I mentioned, we do have subject liaisons, but with limited capacity for collection development. Again, the portfolios are wide. Many of them, again, do an extensive amount of teaching, and to the degree possible, we do provide the support in building collections, but we do really rely on the autonomy of instructional faculty and other folks who are doing instruction and guiding learning for our students and researchers. So a little bit about me and a little bit about the perspective that I bring to this conversation, I hope. I am not a collections person. I've never been a collections person. I am, I say, a recovering music librarian. So for the time that I was a sort of individual contributor, a sort of frontline library professional, I worked in music collections and special collections and digitization, also just you know, across functional areas with respect to providing instruction and reference services, cataloging and metadata, these sorts of things. So that's my background. I am in this role at Purdue University. I'm the inaugural Associate Dean for Organization Development, Inclusion, and Diversity within the Libraries and School of Information Studies, and really one of the first in this role across the United States. There were some, there have been some, but I credit a lot, provide a lot of credit to my dean, Beth McNeil, Dr. Beth McNeil, who created this role and advocated for this role here at her previous institution, where she also served as dean at Iowa State. And, you know, if you're tracking things, you might find it interesting that many larger research institutions have developed similar roles across the United States, certainly within the Big Ten Academic Alliance, which we're members of. There's been just, you know, a wave, if you will, of people who have been placed into roles similar to mine. Prior to my arrival at Purdue University, we never had, the university libraries, I should say, never had a diversity committee, right? Not that the libraries were not engaged in work related to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but the work was never quite structured. And so one of the first things that I did as I came into this role was to establish our Council on Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. The title of that was, the acronym was fairly intentional in terms of we, as a group, decided that we really wanted to lead with equity, although, as I mentioned earlier, the campus has adopted other language. And so we're in the conversation right now. You know, do we reflect the language of the broader institution? Do we provide leadership in the way we want to provide leadership with respect to the terminology that we're using for this work? But at any rate, it's just a conversation we're in the middle of. We essentially, in this role, I was charged upon hiring back in 2020 to develop a diversity, inclusion, and belonging portfolio, really building it from the ground up, and what I, as I refer to it, from the summit down. So thinking about what this might look like across our organization, building alliances across the institution, because we're not the only ones obviously doing this work. Every academic unit, many, you know, all student services units and other entities on campus are involved in this work. And so building those alliances and those coalitions so that we are leveraging each other's expertise, so that we're leveraging each other's resources. All of these sorts of things are things that we're focused on, but also building content and programs, building initiatives that are specific and that support the mission of the libraries and the School of Information Studies specifically. So hopefully that context is a little bit helpful. So getting back to collections, I mean, as I mentioned previously, this is this is not necessarily a new conversation, but in terms of developing strategy, I think it's certainly new and demanding because you know, we don't know exactly where we're headed. We don't have, I think, as a collective, as an organization, and I think really as a profession, a clear vision of where we're headed necessarily with respect to diversity in collections. But you know, some of the challenges as we enter in these conversations, obviously, getting feedback, you know, and this is probably not necessarily, you know, respective only to providing, getting feedback on diverse collections, but just getting feedback and input from instructional faculty is quite frequently a challenge. I mean, we're all busy professionals. We have a lot on our plate, and sometimes, you know, the email inbox is just a little bit much to manage at times. So I think we've always all probably felt this struggle with respect to getting the input that we need. And like I said, in many cases that that acquisition on demand model is sometimes extremely helpful to really help get the resources to our faculty and to our students and researchers in a timely way, and getting specifically the resources that they need. You know, collections are needs are capricious depending on you know, who the faculty are, right? Who specific personalities, what their research agendas are. Certainly, you know, the curricula, I think, is something very important. But you know, where does that go, or how is that managed when people leave? You know, we hear so many stories of prominent scholars, prominent researchers coming to an institution, and you know, they bring the subject domain expertise with them. They bring the focus on a particular area with them, and sometimes they bring in scholars with them, right? Or graduate assistants or postdocs and that sort of thing that also focus on those things. And so you start building a collections specifically related to that teaching agenda. And what happens when there are changes in personnel, or when there, quite frankly, when there are challenges to content, as we're seeing, unfortunately, across some of the country right now, where people in with political power are trying to assert influence over content, and that's something that we need to think strategically about, right? There's many conversations about assessment in many different sorts of areas of practice, and I've seen and certainly read some articles and seen presentations where there are some very promising practices, I think, particularly around distinctive collections, archival collections, and that sort of thing. I've seen a lot of this content in the public library realm, across certain topics and that sort of thing. For example, in children's literature and this sort of thing. But in my, to the best of my knowledge, there really isn't and hasn't been a practical, accepted sort of a best practice with respect to a strategy for assessing large research collections. And I think that many of our content providers, many of our vendors are, they're aware of this. They're trying to help a lot of institutions and organizations kind of grapple with this and get our heads around it. But again, is this something that we just need to operate on the assumption that we're building this from the ground up, right? That we need to sort of accept what's in the canon now and then just think forward in terms of ensuring that there is diverse representation in authorship. There's diversity in the content and the subject area expertise, domain expertise, diversity in languages, diversity in geographic representation, that sort of thing. So that's a tricky question, and it's, I think, a question that we're going to be grappling with for some time. I had a brief conversation when I was very briefly at the Charleston conference last November with a group of academic librarians who are kind of tracking this and who built sort of a distribution list and are tracking this, who is doing good work in this area of assessment, and what does that look like? Of course, again, many of you, I'm sure, have empathy for this with respect to, bandwidth and how limited we are in terms of time and capacity for pushing out effective marketing strategies when we do acquire content that could resonate with folks. And so that would be responsive to a growing area of scholarship, or to an area where there has not been historically enough emphasis and enough content being acquired and developed. So this is always a challenge, particularly, as I said, with the liaison model that we have, and with the instructional and teaching responsibilities that many of our faculty librarians have. So, how do we ensure that people know about the resources that we're acquiring? How do we ensure that our faculty librarians are using the content when they do information literacy instruction and when they're developing course content as well? Access to collections and the path of least resistance. That's just that age-old problem that we have had for at least the last couple of decades, right? That if we acquire content and if it's still only accessible through our website or through an A through Z list, how accessible is that going to be, right? How will our researchers find that, and will search engine optimization be sufficient to point our student population or our instructional our professors to that sort of content, even when we acquire that? So it's something to continue to think about and to build strategies to help people get access to that, and to ensure that people are using the resources that we acquire in helpful and strategic ways. And of course, money. Money is always a pressing issue for all institutions. We have been very lucky as an organization, as an institution. We have been able to make commitments to acquire some primary source content fairly recently, but that happened, of course, through some renegotiations of some of our larger contracts here at Purdue. And so that provided an opportunity that I realized not everyone has that opportunity. And so particularly I think most, the trend obviously is that most institutions are looking at dramatic cutbacks with respect to collections budgets. And, what does that, how does that position us to really be committed to this? I'll just lastly say that I think that, this is something that if you've heard me speak before in other contexts that I've said many times, but you can tell an awful lot about an organization's values by its budget, right? So if an organization says that it's committed to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but is not appropriating resources to actually move any of that work forward, well, then I think one rightfully might question whether that organization or institution really is committed to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So that's a bit of a bit of a soapbox. I apologize about that, but anyway. So we're building again an emerging strategy about this. Sort of what I again, an overused image that I have is we're just throwing a bunch of wet spaghetti up against the refrigerator door and to see what sticks. It makes sense for us to collect in a variety of domains and subject areas because STEM students, even if they're not interested in majoring in African American history, as an example, they are holistic. That's inclusive of our students and faculty. They have other interests, right? And so we have the responsibility to provide the resources that are responsive to the whole individual, right? Of course, everyone is well aware of the increasing interdisciplinarity of the academic sort of mission, if you will. So, how can we position our students, our faculty, our researchers to be prepared for that interdisciplinary focus, right? So, what does it mean to ensure that we have collections that not only address public policy, but the intersection of public policy and community health, or criminal justice as an example, and as it intersects with food science. So how do we ensure that we have the assets that are responsive to that growing sort of approach to scholarship and to learning, right? Building what I mentioned, increasing focus on primary source materials that is happening in across our instructional portfolio, and of course, highlighting that it's really a lot of those primary source materials that really makes our collections unique, and how can we leverage that uniqueness. We're trying to build a portfolio based on peer engagement, right, and anticipated growth in many of these academic areas. There is something for those of you who may be familiar with the work of the Big Ten Academic Alliance Library Initiative. There's a lot going on there in terms of trying to develop something that is called the Big Collection, right? So a distributed, a common collection that everyone has access to. So we're just kind of building that, and that will, of course, provide many opportunities for access to in the expansion, excuse me, of diverse collections across the 15, 16 institutions that make up the BTAA. But again, those conversations are quite nascent, and we're not sure what direction we're going there, but certainly there will be some economy of scale that comes with that. Working with our vendors, right, our content providers, to develop and use the assets that they have developed to help promote, to help market, and to help provide case studies for how a lot of these collections are being used day to day. So that has been, something that we've tried to avail ourselves and have tried to share with our researchers and our instructional faculty. And then, of course, ensuring that our own assets are kind of, up to date, right? That people know, for example, our research guides, right? And that people know where to go to find those resources, and that the resources that we acquire, particularly across a portfolio that in the big bucket we might refer to as diversity, inclusion, and belonging, that they're accessible and that people know how to gain access to those. So this is sort of where we are. I know I probably didn't answer a lot of questions. I think probably you're like we are, in that there are more questions. We have many more questions that we have answers, but we feel like we're in a good position to continue these conversations and to build a strategy that we know is going to have lasting impact on our researchers, our faculty, our students, and we hope impact on the communities that in which we live. So that is all that I have, and I will pass the floor over to my colleague Nathalie.
Oops. Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for the nuanced presentations on the steps needed to build collections and initiatives related to DEI. I'm going to move the slide. On your first steps, I wanted to give a brief publisher, product manager's perspective on DEI and collaboration. What this slide shows here is that our commitment to diversity content goes back many, many years to our microfilm days. In the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the preservation and distribution of content on race and gender became a focus. A few highlights here: the microfilming of the Gerritsen collection on the history of women in the 1970s, or the microfilming of the NAACP papers at the Library of Congress, a decade-long endeavor that resulted in the Black Freedom section of History Vault, our flagship archival collection program. Diversity, equity, and inclusion content at ProQuest is unique and rich because of the acquisitions over the years. Softline in the early 2000s that brought the Diversity Watch collection, originally on CD-ROMs, Chadwick Healy and the Black Studies Center, UPA and History Vault, or Alexander Street in 2016 with its mission statement, Making Silent Voices Heard, reflected in the history, literature, drama, and Mark, the music collection as well from your former life. Our most recent collections, ProQuest Black Studies, LGBT Magazine Archive, Latinx Thought and Culture, the NPR Archive, are all a tribute to our enduring commitment to DEI. It's important to stress that we aren't just talking about products. ProQuest commitment extends beyond the content we provide. Over 20 years ago, we became a charter sponsor of the American Library Association Spectrum Scholarship Program, which helps to create a more diverse and inclusive librarian community. To date, we have sponsored nearly 200 scholars and proudly watched them move into library leadership roles. Also within our company, our team members have built colleague resource groups and alliances representing women, the LGBTQ community, racial diversity, military veterans, disability, and more, which provide guidance to company leadership, as well as support opportunities for all employees to make their voices heard. We also encourage staff to volunteer time to support work within communities. In our team, diversity, equity, and inclusion is core and always at the core of everything we do. Foremost, our products in diversity, equity, and inclusion are driven by our relationship with faculty and librarians. A few examples here include our ProQuest Black Studies board, you can see here, who help us guide decision on content, interface, and new directions. Our women and social movement editors are also featured on this slide, Judith Chun-Woo and Rebecca Jo Plant, who are creating document projects attuned to current curriculum needs and research. Also featured are Mark Stein and Lisa Arellano, our Queer Past editors. These collaborations are essential to us. We are able to create and bring to market unique materials thanks to our partnerships with the best sources, historical societies, archives, organizations, publishers, and distributors of videos. I will give a few examples here. Humanity and Inclusion, a non-governmental organization that won the Nobel Prize for its work on anti-mine personnel and contributed content to our Disability in the Modern World collection. Real Times Media, the owner and publisher of Chicago Defender and other Black newspapers, the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, and then SIP Publication, a pioneering publisher in the UK that disseminated publications of relevance to Britain's Black communities. Some of these relationships take years to build and are again part of a commitment and collaboration around DEI. The challenges are many. It is an evolving landscape. Our indexing team has established procedures to review terms and ensure that our choice of indexing terms are non-discriminatory and reflect recent trends. The 477 terms categorized as diversity or ethnicity are applied across databases in contexts that include sociology, language and literature, history, business, politics, and criminal justice, and include terms covering gender, discrimination, LGBTQ+, indigenous people, sexuality, and cultural groups. New events, topics, and trends require new or updated terminology in order to index accurately and meet researchers' search expectations. Some examples of recently updated terms include gay and lesbian literature, changed to LGBTQ literature. It aligns with existing term LGBTQ studies and new term LGBTQ people, among others. We know we need to further enhance our coverage beyond US and UK perspective, so we are seeking content from underrepresented regions, countries, and continents, with the understanding that it can be difficult to license and source the content. But we keep at it across all our business units, including books, primary sources, newspaper, periodicals, and video, because it is a core mission. In contemporary primary source content that is most in demand, we are working with regulations related to privacy and lack of clarity on rights at times. We do need to be mindful of the risk of exposing individuals. It is sometimes to the detriment of research where we need to be cautious. Getting rights from non-English sources can be challenging with less understanding of the world of aggregators and digital collection. Building relationships, working with advisors, and demonstrating our internal expertise is key to overcome the challenges. As I mentioned earlier, our academic editors play a critical role in understanding DEI fields of research via webinars or podcasts. Ashley Farmer and Hassan Jeffries are two good examples, having both presenting on teaching art history. Our team of expert product managers is also looking for exciting, new, unique content that will support research and teaching. As product managers, we are getting many requests for Asian American, Latinx, Indigenous people, and LGBTQ+ sources. When curating and licensing content to build databases, we seek original content on a topic by the people who lived through, fought, and worked to remove inequities and bring about social change. There are many untapped archives we would like to collaborate on with repositories and libraries around the world. We have supported several DEI faculty-generated open access initiatives, including the #Empire Suffrage Syllabus, released in early 2021 as the result of the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, and the free version of the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, a collaborative crowdsourced project built over 5 years, including contribution by historians, students, librarians, and history buffs. We will supply links to these resources in our follow-up email. Finally, I would like to wrap up with the ProQuest Black's Freedom Struggle website, a curated selection of primary source documents for teaching and learning about the struggles and triumphs of Black Americans. It is openly available and free of charge to anyone. Visitors will find historical newspapers, articles, pamphlets, diaries, correspondence, and more from specific period in American history. It was designed for middle and high school students, as well as early college students, teachers who want to use primary sources, and the general public, anyone with an interest in African American history. This is a very good example of an initiative we are very proud of. So I hope this overview provided a reflection on our collaborative focus and intent in building the most inclusive, unique, multi-format collection of resources to support diversity, equity, and inclusion research and teaching. I thank you for your time, and I will now let Christy tell us about questions you may have had.
Yes, thank you everybody for submitting your questions in our Q&A. There's lots of good ones. Feel free to continue to submit any questions you have, and we'll address as many as we can. So we'll start with, so most of these questions are for you, Mark, of course. So how do you balance the digital first policy with the digital divide in your student population?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something that we are, again, really early conversations about that. You know, we are, as an institution, have not really assessed what that digital divide looks like. I mean, there are lots of assumptions about accessibility, about access to resources and that sort of thing. I think across across our student population, of course, our faculty, population. So we have not done due diligence with respect to assessing that, So I think that with that with that assumption, then I think, or not with that assumption, but until we have a good sense of that, I think it's hard to really grapple with that question. I do know, and I do, access is just never, it shouldn't be an issue, right? I mean, people, if they are having difficulty accessing resources in the format in which we've procured them, then we need to make those adjustments, whatever those are. And I know that our staff, in particular, our faculty, are really, really good at accommodating students' needs and having those conversations with students and faculty and researchers as they come up. So that's not a great answer, but I mean, I'm just being completely honest. We do not have a great strategy with respect to addressing that in particular.
So we had some questions about when you're talking about assessment. So one part of that is you mentioned a distribution list. And so if you could share the name of that, it sounds interesting to connect with others grappling with collections assessment for large collections. Also, if you could share some of the sources on assessing collections and challenges to collections.
Sure, that would involve a little bit of curation on my part, and I'm happy to do that. Again, this came out of an open discussion, except in terms of the distribution list. There was a small cohort of people that were part of a conversation at the Charleston conference who are building a portfolio, just trying to understand the literature and that sort of thing. Again, the literature that I'm aware of is and content to which I've been exposed at conferences and that sort of thing is none of that is really about large research collections, especially some in the context of distinctive collections, archival collections, special collections, that sort of thing, but nothing about large research collections. So I'm happy to spend a little time and curate something and share it with you all for broader distribution if you think that will be helpful.
Great. So what have you found to be an effective marketing strategy for informing faculty of new books and other resources?
So this is to me again?
To you again, sorry, Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, when you have all these new materials that you're
right,
getting for the library, how do you let that faculty know about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, is ineffective as it might be, an email marketing campaign, ensuring that we're engaging social media and that sort of thing, so that people can have, get just tidbits of information. Again, no one that I'm aware of can really keep track of their inbox these days, so we have to be kind of strategic about how we do that. Again, ensuring that those assets that are provided through our content providers and the assets that we build, I think is really, really important. We have at Purdue, and this may exist, this may not exist, it probably doesn't exist in most institutions, a sort of a cohort, if you will, of associate deans, assistant deans, people who have similar titles to mine and similar responsibilities across all of our academic units. And so providing opportunities to have conversations with them who are more connected to our instructional faculty, to let people know what resources are available. And most importantly, again, developing those case studies so that people know not only what the content is, but how other researchers and other instructors have kind of used that content for instruction or for building research portfolios or whatever that looks like. So, it's kind of, I don't think that there is sort of necessarily a best practice, except to communicate, and then communicate more. I mean, that's really the best way to do that. And, again, as I mentioned, that's a big challenge at an institution like Purdue that does not have a traditional liaison model. So we're trying to be as creative as possible, and are trying to be as transparent as possible. And of course, with respect to, again, looking at whether it's social media, whether it's encouraging those who are embedded, those librarians who are embedded in courses or that are building courses themselves and offering courses themselves, really, to make sure that they're aware of the resources that we have at our disposal, and they are, and encouraging them to use those resources as best they can. That's, I think, the best approach there.
Thank you. So Mark, what are your thoughts on classification systems used by libraries? Is there a classification system that is more inclusive than the LC system and DEI system? Is this something libraries should consider, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question. I think LC and DEI are here to stay. I don't see a monumental shift or a replacement to a new classification system helping. I mean, there are, of course, lots of things that you can do with respect to catalog records, with respect to linked data, with respect to tagging that you can do to offer alternate, subject areas and classifications. There are in smaller subject areas. I mean, the one that immediately came to mind when you were reading that question, Christy, was around indigeneity and native collections and that sort of thing. So and I can't quote what they are, but I'm reflecting on particularly, I think, in the Canadian context at the university. Maybe Nathalie might know more about this. At the University of British Columbia, they have a specific library that is focused on indigenous matters, indigenous cultural heritage, and that sort of thing. And they have developed an entire scheme, a scheme in the British way of saying that, in an entire classification system that is specific to those indigenous communities, that honors sovereignty, that honors the sort of practices and cultural responsibilities with respect to access and this sort of thing. So I know they have built those, but I think that, again, the strategies for archival collections, special collections, also provide some opportunities, but I think it's a matter of tweaking and using whatever resources they have, whether there are specific descriptive fields in some of the metadata to offer alternate sorts of descriptions. I think is certainly what is the practice at this point. If there is an emergent practice, an alternate sort of classification scheme being built up, I'm just not aware.
Great, thank you. Nathalie, a question for you. Do you have a Canadian focus in your EDI strategies?
Yeah, so I'm originally from France, but I lived 1 year in Montreal, so I got to meet, and I was doing a lot of interviews of women who have been very involved in feminist movement in the 70s. So I'm trying to get more content from Canada in this area. Sometimes one of our challenge, I mentioned earlier that one challenge can be rights. And so we have great content in some of our anthropology video collection, but sometimes if we license from Canada, we don't have rights to sell in Canada. So that kind of impairs at times our ability to give access worldwide. But so, yes, it's always, when we develop new products, we really try to get balanced coverage, especially if it's around the theme. So Canadian content falls into that. I think that's
Nathalie. All right, here's a big question. So Mark, how do you go about doing a diversity audit of materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, again, I think there could be many approaches to it, right? I mean, you could certainly do it at a layer of granularity. I mean, if you're focused on particular content areas, particular subject areas, right, where you can conduct analyses with respect to what is considered the canon in that particular area, and there are some resources where I believe those sorts of analyses, at least in terms of the materials that are available, right, where you can sort of gauge where your collections are against what might be considered a canon, or if you look at collections for example, I mean, we do not have a Latino history, Hispanic history, whatever terminology that you want to use. We don't have that area, right? So I think that looking at academic institutions that are very, very strong in those subject domain areas, to see what are the areas of focus, because there, I mean, Latino studies is going to be huge, in of itself, and are there, particular sort of segments of that subject area where there might be growth or there might be development, and to sort of try to assess one collection against another collection. So I think that's, could be one approach to doing that work, but most of that work is on, I think, a smaller scale, in terms of, again, I've attended a presentation not too long ago, maybe two years ago or something, by the Amigos Library Consortium. And there was somebody from the public library sphere that was looking at children's literature, and they were looking at, several subject areas, and just looking at the content and ensuring that they had, a critical mass, if you will, of resources based on, based on what they knew was the output, based on content providers, publishers, and that sort of thing. With respect to, as an example, there are many of the National Association of Librarians of Color, for example. They have very robust awards that they give out. The Caldecott Award. Many similar awards. The what is it? The can't remember what the award is for the Rainbow Caucus of the American Library Association. Just conducting, I think, very simple searches and just determining the degree to which your collections represent those award-winning collection or resources over time. I think is I mean, it's a small thing, but I mean, it's certainly something that might help in terms of developing just a sense of where a collection is, and where additional growth needs to happen. So yeah, again, I'm searching for that magic dust as well. I think we all are, yeah, hopefully there will be much more emerging, in the coming years about how different institutions and organizations are going about that work.
Thank you. So we do, speaking of collaboration, we do have a person from a company, Ann's Resource. They've developed a growing library of DEI microlearning courses, and they're finalizing a partnership with a university library to have their courses available to patrons, check out through an internal system. So yeah, Mark and Nathalie, this John is looking for advice on how they can reach a broader audience with libraries because they believe they can help with DEI efforts. So this does speak to that collaboration. So perhaps Mark, you could speak to how you're working with vendors and how that besides acquisition getting those collections, but wherever you want to go with this advice for this person.
Nathalie,
and Nathalie too.
If you have ideas, that would be great. Well, first of all, I think that we're in a fortunate space right now where like folks like the good folks at ProQuest, Clarivate, right, are just paying much more attention to these issues, right? And so they have to go through an intentional sort of process, right, for acquiring materials, for describing the materials, curating those materials and that sort of thing. If those materials don't exist, it doesn't matter if you have the money or not. You can't acquire them if they're not there. We are building collaborations, certainly locally with respect to distinctive collections and that sort of thing, where we are intentionally reaching out to some of our prominent faculty, administrators, that sort of thing, for minoritized or racialized groups, because their histories, their culture, their academic and material outputs are not represented, well, in our distinctive collections. And so that takes years of cultivation, and quite frankly, what we don't have right now, particularly with a large institution like mine, is we don't have a sense of trust, between the many communities that would benefit from these types of collaborations, I think, and these large institutions. We were not built, quite frankly, to be inclusive organizations, and so we're going to have to do a lot of work to develop the trust with institutions and organizations like our local indigenous communities. Why would they entrust cultural materials or language or something like that to a big institution like Purdue University that does not have the best track record with respect to how we have stewarded those resources, or provided access, or we're intentional about preservation and curation. So I don't know, those are just some things that I'm thinking about, but that's again hard question to answer, but I think, like I said, we're in a good sort of space right now where we do have many more opportunities, provided that, again, that you have the resources to make those acquisitions happen. Nathalie, did you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted, I talked about partnerships and so on, and we have a wealth of primary sources, especially, and we're always looking for ways to contextualize them, to make them more available for teaching, etc. So the kind of micro-learning is of great interest to us. So we'd love to have a conversation on that. It's really providing context is super important for us.
Thank you both. And I appreciate those who have shared information in the Q&A, Glenn with that listserv link, and Julie, the University of West Florida Diversity Collection Audit Assessment. So very valuable. I appreciate that. So we just have time for a couple, maybe one or two more questions. Mark, what ways have you found to diversify the STEM resources specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we haven't been so deliberate about that. I think up to this point, again, we have strong faculty presence. We have strong leaders in many of our STEM fields. With respect to who my counterparts are across the university, and I think by cultivating those relationships, I think that's the first step. It's difficult to kind of think about how to create an intentional strategy around STEM disciplines when I don't have more information, right, about an accepted practice or a best practice. I can't. We're very evidence driven, right, in the university context, and so people want data to point to, right, and we just simply don't have those data. So maybe out of these conversations with some of the resources that others have shared, some of these methodologies can be developed that will allow us to bring that content. But right now, it's really based, on assumptions and about assumptions about the lack of diversity. Certainly, if we just think about the lack of diversity in the professorate, that's something that we can point to, and a product of that is, again, an assumption is that we're not going to have a great deal of diversity in terms of our in terms of the collections related, to that person's identity, or related to that person's scholarship or something like that. So yeah, so again, in nascent stages in terms of building those sorts of relationships, and really building a collective awareness, and hopefully, as these sorts of conversations mature and as some of our strategies become a little bit more defined, we will be in a position to take some data, so that people have some evidence about the value that this will bring to the academic enterprise.
Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for all your questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but we appreciate all the submissions, just really excellent questions. And looks like we're at our time, so we're gonna wrap up our presentation.
Sure, great. Thanks, Christy. So thank you so much to Mark and Nathalie for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to Christy for moderating the Q&A. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from this session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.